Well, thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you and share with you. I had promised in an earlier session that I would tell you a bit about my own story, my own journey to Orthodoxy, and give you a bit of insight into my own life that has brought me to this place of becoming part of the Orthodox Church, and is really the story of how I came to discover these truths for myself by the providence and grace of God. So a lot of today's session will be autobiographical. However, scattered throughout my story, I think are a lot of answers to questions that were raised, questions that I were brought to me concerning the liturgy, questions concerning holy tradition and scripture, because those were questions that I wrestled with in my own journey. And so I'll walk through my story, and then hopefully we can draw some lessons out and apply these to some of the questions that have been raised by you and others along the way. So I'll begin with my own background. In terms of my own family, my parents, one of my parents, my mother, was a devout Lutheran. So she was a Protestant Christian, very conservative Lutheran. Very pious, very devout, very sincere, and she was a good example to me what it looked like to try to live out the faith, to read scripture, to pray. She practiced spiritual disciplines regularly. She was a church attender, and all the rest. My father, on the other hand, was not. As far as I could tell, my father perhaps gave lip service to saying, listen to your mother, and she's probably right about God and things like that. But he didn't really practice. He intentionally stopped going to church and didn't really have a place in his life for that. And he lived a lifestyle that did not reflect a living and true faith. And then when it came to my siblings, it was unclear to me what they believed. I could tell that my oldest brother, who was a hero to me, right? He was my oldest brother. He was somebody I looked up to. He wandered away from the faith very early on. It was pretty obvious he did not want anything to do with a Christian lifestyle or Christian belief. And then my next oldest brother also, I couldn't tell. I admired him, but I couldn't tell if faith played any role in his life. My sister, I didn't have a close relationship, and I couldn't tell with her. So from what it looked like to me as a young person growing up in this household, was that I had my mother, who was this person who very sincerely believed in Christianity, believed in Christ, and was looking to live in a way that honored Christ. But no one else in my family really seemed to reflect that same faith that she had. Now, for myself, early on in these years, there was certain fruit that was born intellectually. My family was the sort of family that really enjoyed having good, rigorous debates. They like to debate political topics. They like to debate social topics. They like to debate philosophy and religion. And so around the dinner table, we would have these sorts of conversations about topics that really mattered. And as a result, as a child, I was exposed to a great number of ideas. I had heard growing up proofs for the existence of God. I had heard about the ways in which science and religion could be reconciled. I had heard proofs for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so there was intellectual fruit being born as I soaked these things in, such that I did begin to accept that the world did come from God. I did accept that there was something unique about Christ. But the problem was, in my own upbringing, was that Lutherans, or certainly very conservative Lutherans, like the German Lutherans that my mom came from, they were primarily concerned with salvation by grace through faith and the doctrine of justification that Luther taught, and making sure that you did not get sucked in by Catholic doctrines of works salvation. And so the impression that was left on me from my mother, as well-intentioned as she was, my impression was that all that Christianity really amounted to was saying, well, Jesus died for my sins, and that was it. I didn't know what to do after that, right? What do you do after you've learned that Jesus died for your sins? I suppose, this was what my thinking was as a young person, I suppose I'll live however I want because, well, after all, Jesus died for my sins and salvation is secured, and so I suppose that's fine. And so that's actually precisely what I did. I went out and I lived a life that I saw fit for myself, because from what I could tell, Christianity offered no clear path for how I might live. Now, in terms of what that life for myself, right, the life lived to my own liking looked like, I was an artist. So before becoming an academic and studying religion and philosophy and theology and all of these things, I was an aspiring artist. I did ultimately go to art school. I was a painter, drawer, very classically trained and skilled artist. And everyone looked at me and knew, well, Nathan, he's going to grow up to be an artist. And so I was treated as such, as a prodigy, right, an artistic prodigy. Now, with that, on the one hand, I pursued art. I delved into, circles with other artists, and I created and I created and I created. The other thing that I really loved was I loved women. I loved the beauty of women. And so there was a lot of, lust and sin in that area, part of my life as well. And then the third thing, and I hope this isn't scandalous to anybody, but I also really loved drugs. Now, I say that not because I was somebody who was a drug addict, but because everything about this in my world growing up, as a teenager and doing these things, it was about beauty. I was someone who was obsessed with beauty. I was obsessed with beauty when it came to art. I was obsessed with the beauty of women. And even when it came to drugs, my love for drugs had to do with enhancing my senses so that I could take in and see in new ways the beauty that was around me in the world and in nature. And so it wasn't just about becoming intoxicated. It was about opening my eyes in order to see new realities. So I was a hedonist, right? I lived a life that was centered around pleasure, but that pleasure was all focused in all of its directions on beauty. Now, one day, this lifestyle that I was living did end up resulting in opening my eyes to new questions that ended up changing the trajectory of my entire life. And again, I hope this isn't scandalous to anybody, but I was specifically fond of a drug called LSD. It's a hallucinogenic that people take. And for myself, I had taken this drug, and the difficulty with this particular drug is that when you take it, it lasts for a very long time, 8 to 10 hours. And so if it goes wrong, if bad things start to happen, there's no way of sobering up and snapping out of it. And for me, that's exactly what happened. It went very, very wrong for me. And the reason this was important to my spiritual journey is because while I was having this experience, I started asking myself questions of how could I make this stop? How can I make this experience that I'm having, this experience in my mind, stop? And one thought occurred to me during that time, which was, I could kill myself. Now, I didn't say this as something that was in despair and I was trying to bring an end to suffering. It's just that on this drug, certain possibilities sound reasonable that wouldn't otherwise sound reasonable. So it was a very sort of analytic point that said, well, if I were to kill my body, I suppose that would stop the chemical reactions. But then a second thought followed immediately after that. And that thought was that the mind and consciousness, thinking, thoughts, are not material objects. They're not things that I can hold in my hand. And so, just because my body dies, does that mean that my thoughts will also die? Now, what I didn't realize at the time, because I hadn't read philosophy, I hadn't yet delved into philosophy, this is one of Plato's arguments for the immortality of the soul. Plato points out that our world consists of things that are material objects that can be broken apart, right? Organisms and things like that. And he points out that there are other things like numbers that are not objects, but they're real. And his question is the mind more like things like numbers and those immaterial objects, or is it more like material objects? And his point is that the mind is much more like things like numbers. Thoughts are not tangible material objects. And so this is why Plato thinks that just because the body dies, that doesn't mean that the mind also dies, that it must continue on. And that was essentially what had occurred to me in this state. It occurred to me that it was possible that even if my body died, that my mind, which was in this state of terror, might endure. And the terrible thought was, what if it endures in that state of terror? And this was the first time for me that the idea of hell became plausible. Not because it presented itself as a place, but I realized that I was, in these moments, shaping my soul, shaping my mind. And the thought that my mind might in some way endure past my body meant that it's possible that how I shape myself endures after death. And suddenly I became acutely aware of the question and the importance of the question, what lays on the other side of death? What awaits me after I die? And that moment, changed the rest of my life. I suddenly became obsessed with the realization that every second that passes, death is a little bit closer, and a little bit closer, and a little bit closer. And I needed to know what was on the other side of it. And so this is the time where suddenly for myself, I had to find answers. And I began to pursue answers wherever I could find them. So I would go to priests, and I would interrogate priests with questions about what happens after you die, questions about what God is like, whether I have free will, whether I can do certain things to determine my fate on the other side of death. If I heard that there was a speaker who was going to be talking about religious or philosophical matters, I'd go hear that speaker, and then afterwards I would stop them and I would corner them. I'd ask them questions. If I had a relative who was a religious person, I would corner them and I would ask them questions. I would go to universities that I didn't attend. And I would schedule times to sit down with professors of philosophy and religion, and I would ask them questions just to try to get answers. This became an obsession for me. And the thing that stood out as so interesting to me was that very few people I talked to seemed to take that question as seriously as I did. Many priests thought it was strange that I would be so obsessed with the question, what happens after I die? They thought there must be something mentally wrong with me, which struck me as strange because I thought, you're a priest. Surely you understand the importance of this question, right? And I found that many of them didn't. Very few people I ever spoke to understood the gravity of the fact that I'm going to die and that there are questions about what happens after that point. But nonetheless, that was my journey, and I began to obsessively pursue this. Now, this went from the time I was a teenager, which was when this initial awakening happened, into my years in college, where I went to art school, and I did end up going to art school, the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, which is a very prestigious art school here in the United States. And while I was there, I continued to ask those questions. I'd ask those questions to my peers. I would go to Johns Hopkins University, which was a nearby university, and I'd ask people questions. I continued to pursue them and to pursue them and to pursue them. And at some point, my grades in art school began to slip because I was more concerned with the questions of who is God? What is God like? Do I have free will? What lies on the other side of death? I was more concerned with those questions than I was with art. And so I let my studies slip because I was studying these other questions. And at some point in my third year at art school, I decided to actually leave art school and formally study philosophy. Now, when I did this, I didn't do this because I wanted to get a degree in philosophy. I wasn't looking to become a professor. I had no motive other than answers. That's all I wanted. I just wanted answers. And so I left art school and I enrolled in a different university, and in that university, I found a couple of mentors by God's providence. One of those mentors was a philosophy professor, and one was a religion professor. And these mentors, these professors, recognized that something was different about me than the other students. They recognized that many of the other students were there to get a degree. They were there because they were concerned about their grades. But they recognized that with me, I was there because I had questions that needed answering. I wasn't there for grades. I wasn't there for a degree. I wasn't there to get a job. I was there because I needed answers. And thankfully, these professors, seeing that, ended up treating me very differently than they did the other students. They essentially mentored me and created room for me to take their classes but just do research. They created a research program where I could pursue questions about philosophy and religion, where I could follow the questions wherever they led, follow one answer to another, to another, to another. And they spent a tremendous amount of time with me, mentoring me and guiding me through this search. And this led to other types of exposure that were very unusual for somebody who was an undergraduate in college like myself. They would take me to professional conferences like the American Academy of Religion, where you have scholars from all over the world come together. And there they would introduce me to famous scholars, and they would let me interrogate those scholars about my questions. And eventually I actually began to speak at some of those conferences and publicly debate and engage some of those scholars as well. And there's some funny stories related to those, but I'll skip over those for now. But in the end, the thing that was always there was a drive for answers. I knew that these questions mattered, and they mattered more than anything else, which is why I pursued them with all of my strength, all of my might, all my mind. And this led through years and years and years of study. After I finished my degree in philosophy, I went on and I did a master's degree in church history and in systematic theology. And then I went on and I did a pair of doctorates in historical theology and systematics alongside the study of philosophy again. Now, certain things that emerged along the way while I was studying these questions, there were certain topics that kept coming up. One was that my interest in art drew me to certain aspects of ancient art. I started to recognize in things like ancient temples, ancient idols, right? Ancient architecture, that there seemed to be something more than just art here. This wasn't just empty, dead stone. There was a spiritual presence in these things. This is the sort of thing that we talked about with the energia that's communicated. But there was something that I recognized when I would look at ancient Egyptian art or architecture, when I would encounter these idols, that it seemed that these were not just decoration. These were not just illustrations, that there was some sort of spiritual presence and power in these things. And I was drawn to that ancient form of religion for that reason. Another way in which the ancient kept on beckoning me was that I spent a lot of time with the Old Testament. I spent a lot of time reading the Old Testament, oftentimes more than I read the New Testament. And my favorite book in the Old Testament, as strange as this might sound, was the book of Leviticus. And I was fascinated with the book of Leviticus because it was a book it was a manual for priests in an ancient world. And I wanted to understand what these priests did and how they approached this God who had revealed himself to them.
And somehow in studying the book of Leviticus and studying these other ancient forms of religion, there emerged in me a certain sadness, I would say. That sadness was not because I thought there was something negative about these things, but that sadness was because, at least here in my American context, I didn't see a religion of this kind. Religion, as it seemed to be practiced in America, seemed to be commercial, popularized, made accessible to the masses, right? It seemed to be something that was watered down, and it lacked all of that ancient holiness and spirituality that I seem to see in these ancient texts and in these ancient temples and in this ancient architecture. And it was sad to me, because what I found was, when I looked at things like the book of Leviticus, I was drawn in by that strange way in which holiness, the holiness of God, in some ways pushes you away because he is high and lofty and otherly and frightening. And at the same time draws you in because you recognize that he's good. And that strange push and pull you get from the holy was something that I recognized, I longed for, and I envied those ancient Jews who had that experience of a deity like that. But I didn't know any place where I could find that in my own experience, here in a contemporary context in the United States. But nonetheless, that was the draw that I had. Now, in looking at religions and the ancient and this longing that I had for answers, I decided to zero in at some point on Christianity. And there were a few different reasons for this. I had mentioned that I was exposed to different apologetics and arguments growing up. So my mom had certainly introduced me to proofs for the existence of God. But I'd also, as I mentioned, been exposed to all sorts of arguments concerning the significance and the uniqueness of Christ. And I was convinced, from these studies that I was doing, I was convinced that one cannot simply say that Jesus is a prophet, right, as Islam might say. Because I recognized when I looked at the teachings of Christ, Christ is making very specific and unique claims concerning divinity. Claims that if he were merely a prophet would be blasphemous. Right? The Pharisees obviously recognized this in the types of claims that Jesus was making. And I saw that as well. And so I knew that merely saying he's a prophet or he's a good man just didn't work. Right? That's not a possible interpretation of who Jesus is. I also recognized, one of the things that I thought was so fascinating was, I recognized that Jesus also is no ordinary man. One thing that I found so interesting is that when you look at the writings of his opponents, none of his opponents claim that Jesus didn't do miracles. They all admit that he did miracles. They just dispute how he did the miracles, right? They claim he has a demon, for example. And so when I looked at this, I recognized it's also a problem, not just, you can't just say he's a prophet, but you also have to acknowledge that however you account for who Jesus is, you have to account for the fact that he was a wonder worker. And that this was part of how he drew followers. This was part of his influence. And so once you admit that he's a wonder worker, and you admit that he's making claims of divinity, I really saw only two possibilities. The one possibility is that the Pharisees are correct and he has a demon, and he's a deceiver. And the other possibility is that he is exactly who he says he is. He's the Son of God incarnate. And that's the source of what he does. And in terms of looking at that, I simply looked at the thing that pushed me towards saying that Jesus is not only a wonder worker, but is of God and is in some sense the Son of God, although early on I didn't have a clear sense of what that really would mean, was the fact that in the people who are followers of Christ, I noticed good fruit. And I thought, there is no way that someone who is a deceiver and a demoniac could ever produce people of the quality and goodness that I see in Christians. And so for that reason, I said, the fruit that the life and the ministry and the religion of Christ has borne is testimony to the fact that he's of God and not of the devil. And this was part of the reason that I came to embrace Christ as in some way significant. But with this, I also noticed an interesting fact of exclusivity. I noticed that when I was looking at Christianity, unlike so many other religions, insisted that it was not only true, but it was uniquely true, that Christ was the way. So I knew during this time, I had read not only Jewish literature, I had started reading Islamic literature. I had looked at things like Buddhism as well. And as I looked at these other religions, I saw that in many cases, the religion would present itself as a way, right? A way of navigating the waters of life. Or in the case of Islam, even though it would demand submission, there were passages in the Quran that suggested that good Jews and Christians might find favor with Allah and things like that. But I noticed that in Christianity, there was this type of exclusivity that was there. And so for this reason, my persuasion of being persuaded not only that God exists, being persuaded that not only there is something unique about the person of Jesus Christ, but also being persuaded that that uniqueness also demands some sort of exclusive commitment to Him, is what started to draw me back in to Christianity. Now, this was a very general sense of a direction for me. This was not yet that I was going to practice Christianity. It was merely moving toward a certain type of answer. And so as I began to delve into my studies and ask further questions, I decided to focus in on the father of Western Christianity, Augustine of Hippo. Because I recognized, from my study of history, I recognized that Augustine was somebody who had shaped not only Catholic theology, but also Protestant theology. And at the time, I was unaware of Eastern Orthodoxy. So as far as I knew, Augustine was just the father of later Christian theology in all its forms, being unaware of the Eastern tradition. And so I focused on the study of Augustine, and I really consumed Augustine's texts. But as I studied Augustine, and I studied him very deeply, I started to become aware that Augustine was heavily influenced by Platonists, and any Augustine scholar would admit this. Augustine himself admits this, where he was awakened. I mentioned this in an earlier talk, that he is awakened by Neoplatonism. As he says in the Confessions, I read in certain books of the Platonists, not in these exact words, but with all the same meaning and intent. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Augustine was so interested in Platonism at one point in his younger years, he actually said, I am convinced I will find nothing in Holy Scripture that conflicts with the writings of the Platonists. Now, later on, Augustine had to retract that statement and say he may have been a little too zealous about Platonism in those young years. But nonetheless, I recognized that there was an important influence here. So, this is what forced me to look carefully at Platonism. So I began to study the Neoplatonists. And then studying the Neoplatonists, I needed to study Plato himself and Aristotle. So I went backwards into the ancient philosophy and the pagan philosophical discussions that sat in the background of what Augustine himself had developed. And then with that, I also started looking forward and examining the reception of Augustine. So I began to look at medieval scholasticism, people like Thomas Aquinas, people like Bonaventure, John Duns Scotus, and that medieval legacy. And then beyond that, I began to look at the Protestant Reformation in order to see the sorts of disputes that followed on the heels of that, in order to see the contrast between the Protestant reception of Augustine and the Catholic reception of Augustine. Now, this study, rather than drawing me closer to Christianity, now as I said, remember, I had become convinced, I was persuaded that God exists, I was not an atheist, I was a theist, I was convinced that there was something real and true and divine and unique about Jesus, but I wasn't yet a Christian, right? And in studying Augustine, what I was hoping I would find was an ancient form of Christianity, an ancient form of Christianity that would resonate with the sorts of things I had seen in temple worship, the sorts of things I had seen in Leviticus, the sorts of things that drew me to religion in the first place and that I thought was so alluring about the holy. And rather than being drawn in, I found that my study of Augustine and his legacy repelled me from Christianity. The deeper I dove into the study of Western Christianity, its history and its legacy, the further I withdrew from Christianity. Because one of the things that I began to see is I began to see all of those ways in which the type of disconnect between the God I read about in the Bible and the type of God described in Western scholasticism, I saw that ripping apart, the differences between these two things, that whoever Augustine was describing, whoever Thomas Aquinas was describing, whoever the Reformation scholastics were describing, this was not the God I was reading about over here. This was someone else, and I didn't recognize this. And I was not drawn to it. It did not draw me in the way the God of the book of Leviticus drew me in. And so I withdrew from Western Christianity entirely. And not only did I withdraw from it, I became an overt opponent of Christianity. My master's thesis was actually a direct attack on Christianity. It was a direct attack on Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and the legacy of that tradition. Now, what was the alternative? As I had said, I still believed in Jesus in some sense. I wasn't sure what it meant to say that he was the Son of God, but I believed that there was something unique about him. I believed he was from God. I began to craft for myself essentially a religion of my own. The religion of my own was really composed of the God of the philosophers. I began to turn to people who were not Christians, who seemed to rebel against Christianity in the same way I had rebelled against Christianity, but looked for a God who was more present, was more active in the world, who had free will in a way that was more reflective of the sort of thing I had seen in the book of Leviticus and other Old Testament passages. I turned to the God of the philosophers. And with that, the God of the philosophers, I brought into it a Jesus of sorts. Now again, this was a Jesus of my own vague making from looking at ancient texts. This was a Jesus pulled from ancient paintings. This was a Jesus that I was in some ways trying to piece together through these vague puzzle pieces that I'd seen in history, but was not the Jesus that I was reading about in Western Christianity. And then with that, I sought to add even my own practices that were reflective of the type of ancient reverence that I saw in things like Leviticus, but I didn't think I could find anywhere in religion, at least practiced here in the United States. But over time, I was troubled by a couple of questions. Not only was I troubled by the fact that this religion, this strange form of Christianity that I had constructed for myself, not only was I troubled by the fact that it was one of my own making, I was also troubled by a very simple question, but an important question. What is Christianity? At some point, I wanted to know, is Christianity something that has essential properties? Something that you can say, this is the core of Christianity that runs through every version of Christianity? Or is Christianity more like an empty cup that just has the words Christianity on it, and you can put into it whatever you want and take out of it whatever you want, and as long as it's in the cup, it's Christianity? That's certainly what I had done with this thing that I was crafting for myself. But the reason that was particularly troubling for me is because as I looked at Western Christianity and as I studied its history, what I realized is that its history was a history of disputes. That Augustine himself had conflicting theology. The young Augustine disagrees with the older Augustine, and the older Augustine disagrees with the middle Augustine. That Augustine himself did not have one consistent theology. He himself changed his mind on numerous occasions and set the stage for later disputes, because some people liked the younger Augustine better than the older Augustine. When I looked at medieval scholasticism, even though this was prior to the Reformation and you had one Catholic church from what I could tell, you still had disputes between Dominicans, like Thomas Aquinas, and Franciscans, someone like Bonaventure, or John Duns Scotus, who completely disagreed on any number of points. In the Reformation, the disputes continued. Not only did you have disputes internal to Catholicism, but then you had disputes in Protestantism where the Protestants disagreed with the Protestants. And when I looked over all of these, the question that kept coming back to me is, if all of this is Christianity, what do they share in common? And I had trouble coming up with anything that ran through all of them, other than the word Christianity. And this kept coming back to me. What is Christianity? Is it something, or is it just a label that we can put on whatever we want? And I didn't have an answer. I knew that there were different views of Christ, of the Trinity, of salvation, right, of the church, of Scripture, and I could not come up with any consistent thread. So this journey went on until another fateful encounter, a fateful moment for me, was in my PhD studies. And it's when I read St. Athanasius of Alexandria. Now, I was aware of Athanasius' significance in the history of the church, but I had never really dug deep into his text. And I was taking a class with a patristics scholar, right? Someone who is a scholar whose focus is the church fathers. And in this class, we were looking at all primary sources, all the writings of Athanasius, of Arius, who he's disputing, of Alexander of Alexandria, right, the bishop of the period, these early Christian disputes concerning the divinity of Christ. And when I read Athanasius, I was struck by this very simple fact. I had no idea what he was saying. And I had not said that in years. So one of the things that happens when you study systems of thought is that you tend to master those systems of thought. So if you're reading the thought of John Calvin and you master Calvin's way of thinking, and then you go and you read a Calvinist, right, an advocate of John Calvin's thought, you can anticipate what the person will say because you understand the system that's there in their thinking. And I had at this point mastered the various Catholic systems of thought and the various Protestant systems of thought, and I rarely read anything that came as a surprise. But when I read Athanasius, and I read him carefully, I knew that he was not saying anything I had ever read before. And that was a shock to me. This marked a moment in which I needed to again understand. Because as I read Athanasius, I knew of his significance. I knew of his significance to the church, and it was strange to me that the things he would say about Christianity, the things he would say about Christ, the things he would say about the gospel would be so totally alien that I had no box in which I could put them. And so a new obsession emerged for me. This obsession was trying to understand what this Athanasius is actually saying that I've never heard before. And as I began to study Athanasius again and again and again, and I began to study Arius, who is disputing, and I began to study Alexander of Alexandria, who is also involved in the discussion, and I began to study the Council of Nicaea that led to this, that this discussion led up to, a new type of Christianity started to take shape, one I had never heard of before. I started to recognize in Athanasius a different problem for humanity. The problem was not the original sin problem that I had read in Augustine, I recognized that in Athanasius, there was a concern that humanity is a dying species because we've turned away from the author of life, and that the incarnation was that point in which that life begins to be poured back into humanity. All the things that we've talked about over these sessions, right? That different picture of anthropology, man as an icon of God, the natural connection between man and God, the vision of the incarnation as something in which the Creator enters the creation in order to heal it and restore it, started to take shape. The distinction between God's essence and His energies, all of those things started to take shape as I read Athanasius and the surrounding authors. And I also began to read the Cappadocians, right? The authors who were right on the heels of that generation of Athanasius, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, and eventually the Council of Constantinople. And as I read these authors and this different vision of Christianity took place, something happened. I recognized that this was a Christianity I did not know. Whatever this was, it was so different than everything I had studied and rebelled against and argued against. This was something I'd never heard of. And the other thing with that is that I also recognized that all of the things that I had critiqued about Christianity, all of the things that I found problematic in the legacy of Augustine, were absent from these authors. In fact, their intuitions and the ways in which they spoke had a greater resonance with the things that I was trying to build on my own. But also what I noticed is that their solutions to the problems I was trying to solve were better than the solutions that I had come up with. And I suddenly found myself wondering, have I just discovered some strange pocket of Christian authors? This small generation of a few people who have this very peculiar vision of Christianity? Or are there other Christians who thought this way? And so I began to dig. I began to read obsessively all of the Eastern Church Fathers, everyone I could get my hands on, people before Athanasius, people after the Cappadocians, Maximus the Confessor, Nemesius of Emesa, John of Damascus, and others. And as I began to read this Eastern tradition, a certain vision of Christianity not only took shape, but what struck me about this was that unlike the Western tradition, which was a tradition of disputes, right? Augustine disputes with himself. The medieval schools dispute with each other. The Reformation disputes with the medieval schools. This was the first time that what I saw was a tradition that said, this is what Christianity is. This is what was handed down to us. This is what we believe. This is what we must preserve. And that every author, after every author, after every author, after every author said the same thing and agreed. And they preserved that tradition. What I was looking at was 1,000 years of continuity. 1,000 years of agreement on this is the faith that was handed down to us. This is what Christianity is. I had never seen anything like that in the history of Western Christianity. I had never seen anything like that in the history of ideas generally. And it was so extraordinary, and it stood out to me as so unique that I truly believed in that moment I was staring at a miracle. That the only way in which that could happen is by divine providence, a miracle of God. Now keep in mind, I had read all of these authors and I was still unaware of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Even though there was a giant Eastern Orthodox Church 2 blocks from where I lived. So one day, when I made the connection between Eastern Orthodoxy and these authors, I walked to that church. Now here's what I expected to find. I expected to find something that wasn't ancient but was contemporary. I expected to find something that rather than echoing the things that I had read had somehow diverged from it. I had expected to find that this tradition that may be preserved for 1,000 years had gone astray and no longer existed, and that whatever they were teaching and whatever they were doing was no longer what I was reading in these ancient texts. That's what I expected to find. And I walked into that Orthodox church, and I said, I need a priest. And a man approached me, and he said, I'm a priest. And I sat him down, and I told him my journey. I told him all of the things, all the problems I had with Western Christianity, all the critiques I had of it. And then I started telling him about these Eastern Church Fathers who I had been reading, and everything that I discovered in them and what it sounded like they were saying. And when I finished, after he had patiently listened, he said, yeah. He said, yes, well, your critiques of Western Christianity, yes, we agree with those. And he said, and those authors you're reading, yes, we have them here. And he started to point to icons throughout the temple and saying, yep, there's Athanasius, and there's Basil, and there's Gregory, and there's Gregory of Nazianzus. That's Maximus over there, that's John of Damascus. And he said, and yes, all the theology you described, that's our theology. We still believe that today. And I could not believe my ears. That was so extraordinary to me. I could not believe that he was telling me the truth. So that began a journey of me looking at Orthodoxy. I went to my first Divine Liturgy that Sunday. And the next thing that happened was not just something that was intellectual, but this experience tied in with all of that ancient resonance that I talked about. I talked about being drawn into temple worship. I talked about the book of Leviticus and those sorts of things that had drawn me in. And when I walked into the Divine Liturgy and I observed it, I was struck by the fact that it was ancient, that it was reverent, that it smelled and looked and felt holy. And I was also struck by the amount of continuity with Old Testament temple worship. I saw the various ways in which the liturgy itself paralleled and mirrored the Old Testament tabernacle worship I had looked at, the temple worship I had looked at amongst the Jews, but it had been adjusted to reflect new realities. I saw the parallels, but I also saw the differences. And it was an extremely powerful experience for me. Extremely powerful because it was the first time that the ideas I had been studying and had started to find so attractive in these Eastern writers, so persuasive in these Eastern writers, had been brought together with all of these artistic, intuitional things that I had about all of all of the love of ancient and holy temple worship and practices, and the two finally converge together in a divine liturgy. Now, I had questions. I had a lot of questions. There were a lot of things that I saw in the liturgy, that I saw in the Orthodox practices that struck me as strange. Sorts of questions that many of you have asked, right? Questions about what's with, what is it about venerating Mary? Why are they venerating Mary? Why are they asking Mary to pray for them or to save them? Why are they invoking saints? Why are they kissing icons? There were a lot of questions that I still had. And so I went into dialogue with this priest, and I asked him those questions. And he said to me, well, those practices were advocated by the very authors that you mentioned, very authors that you yourself have been reading and have advocated, people like Basil, people like John of Damascus. And so he pointed me back to the church fathers I had been studying. And so I began to study again and dig for those practices and ask them those questions. I started asking the church fathers those questions. And as I began to ask them those questions, I found two things. One, he was correct, that they did in fact endorse these practices. The other thing I found is that when they offered answers to why they do those things, the answers were incredibly profound. The answers were so often more profound than the objection that I was leveling. And so one by one, my objections began to fall away as I engaged the Eastern Fathers, pursuing answers. And over time, I faced a decision. Was I going to continue to hold on to the religion that I had constructed for myself, the religion of my own making, or was I going to embrace what struck me as very clearly and very plainly the true faith preserved by God's providence in the true church? And over time, a shift took place in me. Early on, I would say that most of my journey was a journey of understanding, seeking faith. I was seeking answers in order that I might believe. And at some point, the church fathers won me over to such an extent that I began to simply trust them. And that's when the shift took place, where it was now faith-seeking understanding. I still had questions, but they had so persuaded me that they were keepers of truth that even on the things where I wasn't sure what the answers were, I was willing to trust them. I was going to keep asking my questions, but I was going to trust them that they had answers, and their answers were good, better than my objections. And this is when I decided to abandon the religion of my own making and embrace Orthodox Christianity. Now, I would say, on the one hand, that might sound like that's the point where it's the end of my journey. But I was married, and my wife had no idea what I was looking into. And when I told her about Orthodoxy and I said, I want to become an Eastern Orthodox Christian, she was raised Protestant. She had no idea what that is. She said, I have no idea what that is. It strikes me as weird. It strikes me as strange. I don't like it. I want to stay away from it. And suddenly I found myself in a position where I was drawn to the church, but my wife didn't want to go. And I was counseled by the priest. I was counseled by the priest to wait for her. He would make me a catechumen. And he explained to me that the catechumen is somebody who is tied to the church. They've confessed their desire to become part of the church, but they are in this trial period. And he recommended that I remain a catechumen and I wait for my wife. And I also asked, what do I do? Do I try to argue with her? Do I try to persuade her? And he wisely counseled me and told me, don't argue with her. He said, don't argue with her, don't persuade her. Just pray, live the Orthodox life, let her see the fruit of it in your life, and entrust her to God. And I asked, why? Why? Shouldn't I try to persuade her? And he explained, he said, look, Nathan, Dr. Jacobs, he said, I've been to seminary and I would not want to debate you. He said, I can't imagine being your poor wife who would have to go toe-to-toe with you in a dispute. I just think it would be best if you just pray for her. And that was the advice that he gave me. And I began to see all the different ways in which God in his providence started to draw her near to the Orthodox faith. I won't share her story because it's not mine to share. But I will say this. There were extraordinary moments. She struggled with icons, for example. She thought it was strange that not only that we had icons, but that we'd kiss icons. And one day, she had started to open up to occasionally visit an Orthodox church. And one Sunday morning I said, well, are you ready to go to the liturgy? And she said, I don't want to go. And I thought, oh, this is discouraging. She doesn't want to go. Something's gone wrong. And she said, no, I don't want to go because I had a dream last night. And in my dream, I came to understand why you venerate icons. And she said, and I realized in that dream that to not honor the icons is to dishonor the icons. Now, what my wife did not know is that that's a quote from John of Damascus. And she said, and I don't feel that I'm in a place in my heart where I can get myself to honor them, so I don't want to be around them because I wouldn't want to dishonor them. And when I heard that, I thought, the Holy Spirit is active and doing a work in her heart. I'll let her be. And over time, over the years, she ended up coming alongside, and we as an entire family joined the Orthodox Church. And for us, it was actually through quite a bit of trial as well when that time finally came. But I will say that that's the journey. That's how it culminated. So there you go. That's where you get a bit of a glimpse into my world and my journey. There's all sorts of things in there that I skipped over. Things about some of the areas of philosophy that I studied, some of the areas of philosophy that I've worked in and engaged throughout the years, but I think that gives you enough of my story to get a sense of how that journey toward orthodoxy emerged and why I have a good sense of not only Western Christianity, but also its contrast with the Christian East.